Hello, and welcome to my series on Kerbal Space Program and how to build a rocket that will be able to fly to and land on the moon and return safely back on Kerbin. This is Kerbal Space Program version 1.04. It's as of now, the latest version available. You'll notice I have a lot of things that aren't part of the base game. Some of these icons over here, this little alarm clock tool, a few other things. The game is pretty heavily modded right now. My version is. The vast majority of those mods really just add some graphical improvements, make the game a little bit prettier to look at. There's a couple that add some tools and some informational interfaces that just add some convenience. One of the things I think is kind of lacking from the base game is there's a lot of information that you could figure out through what little it gives you if you're willing to do some algebra and some other things. But yeah, I play this game to launch Kerbals into space, not to do math problems. So added a few mods that just help provide some of that information. So again, what we're going to do is we're going to build a rocket to go to the moon and land there and return safely. So we'll go ahead and click on the vehicle assembly bay here. And I'm going to talk through a few tips and tricks on how to build things. I'll talk about a couple of the mods I have that I think are extremely useful and very much worth getting because they kind of add some what I consider missing features of the game. So we'll go ahead and close this little pop-up tutorial message. Now the first thing you need to do is pick your command pod. The way I like to build rockets, and I think kind of the recommended way to do it, is start by building it kind of in modules. Let's think of each part of the rocket or each stage has a different job, and you want to build each part to fulfill the mission of that job. So we'll click our command pod. This is the single Kerbal, so this is a manned pod of Jebediah. If I click over here to crew, I can see, and I can change who's piloting if I wanted, but I'm not going to do that. So this is a single Kerbal pod. This will make a smaller rocket than if I'd gone with like the triple one, which I could do that, but for this, we're going to keep things simple, and really the less mass you have on a rocket, the easier it's going to be to work with. It just requires less energy to get it places. It's going to be a little more maneuverable. So we'll kind of start simple. So this pod, pardon me, this pod has a heat rating. It's kind of got a built-in heat shield. We could add another heat shield if we wanted, if we go into aerodynamics. There's an additional heat shield we can add, but we don't really need it for what we're doing. So this, what's the last job we're going to have? Is it's going to be coming into the atmosphere in Kerbin after we've been to the moon and landing safely on the ground. Well, this will get us through the atmosphere with heat because it's heat shielded, but it's going to be going too fast once it gets in contact with the ground because there's no parachute. So we'll add our parachute by going to Utilities. Grab this Mark 16 nose cone parachute, and that adds our first stage, stage 0, or actually it'll be our last stage once the rocket's complete. But this configuration of just the command pod with the parachute is essentially our Kerbin lander. This is enough for us to land safely on Kerbin to fulfill that last piece of the mission, or that last stage. So you'll have seen when I pulled out the command pod, this Kerbal Engineer redo interface comes up. This is what provides some of that information that you don't get in the base game. Also a little bit of information down here, but I'm going to focus really up here. And a lot of this is just kind of the information you could get by adding things up, by looking at information on the parts to figure out your mass and to figure out, which you have a little bit of it here too, but figure out how much thrust you have and all that stuff. But really what we're after is these two values, is TWR, which is thrust to weight ratio, and then delta V, which is delta for change, V, velocity, is how much can you change your velocity. And that's also just kind of a measure of kind of your total energy for the ship. So a bigger ship with more thrust might have the same delta V as a smaller ship with less thrust, because proportionally they're going to be the same. They're going to be able to go the same places and do the exact same things because they have the same delta V. So we have our lander here. Now, what's the job that's going to be immediately before landing on Kerbin? Well, we'll have landed on the moon, hopefully, and have taken back off from the moon and headed towards Kerbin. So we're going to add go to structural and add a stack decoupler. and that's going to separate this last Kerbin landing module from our moon landing module, which of course is going to include this part too. But so we'll go into fuel tanks because we'll need some fuel. Now, there are 3 types of fuel tanks in the Kerbal Space Program. There are RCS fuel tanks, and RCS fuel uses monopropellant. If I go over here to command and control, you have these RCS thrusters. These are for like very fine-tuned kind of adjusting your heading and position when you're already in space. And it's really what's good for like when you're trying to dock with another craft, just to give you that, forward, backwards, left, right, up, down movement without having to change the direction of your pointing and all that. So for this mission, we're not going to worry about that, but just be aware that that's there. You have your standard fuel tanks, which have, and I'm going to right-click on here. Right-clicking will, unless you mouse over it again, will freeze kind of the information for that part in place, and also provide this extra information on the right, which we'll talk about here in a second. But regular fuel tanks have both liquid fuel and oxidizer. Now, this is in perfect proportion. You don't have to adjust these at all. And you can stack them all up and they'll all add together in one big fuel tank until you have separators or other things in between. This is what you need for rockets, because the liquid fuel needs oxygen to burn, and when you're in space, there's no way to get oxygen because there's no atmosphere. Now, there's also these liquid fuel fuselages, and they have just liquid fuel. Now, the nice thing about these is they can hold a lot more liquid fuel, because if you look at these, it actually needs more oxidizer than it needs fuel. So these can carry nothing but fuel. But how do they get the oxygen to burn? Well, they're for jets. They're going to be flying in the atmosphere, so they can have air intake, so they'll pull that oxygen just out of the air they're flying through, and that's how they can burn the fuel. Rockets don't have that, so they need the oxidizer. Nothing's going to stop you from putting one of these on a space rocket, but unless you're, if you're not paying attention, you can throw some of these on there and not have the oxidizer, and then these aren't going to burn. You're just going to have a fuel tank that, yeah, you got fuel, but you can't do anything with it. So be careful what kind you pick. So I'm going to go with this T200 fuel tank. It's the shorter one. I don't need a whole lot of fuel to actually land on the moon and to take back off and get back to Kerbin, because once you're kind of at that point, you can do what you need to do with not a whole lot of fuel. Then I'm going to need an engine. Now, there's different sizes of fuel tanks and height, but there's also diameter, and I think there's 4 different diameters of fuel tanks you can use. For this particular diameter, there are 4 engines that will fit it within the same diameter. So what are the difference between the engines? Well, if I look at this engine, this is a swivel liquid fuel engine. There's kind of 3 different things you need to look for. You need to look for the thrust, you need to look for the engine ISP, the thrust is also up here, and then if it has a gimbal and vectoring range. So the thrust is pretty easy. The number, just how much thrust, how much push is it going to give you to propel you in the direction you're pointing. It's split into 2 different values. There's an ASL, which means at sea level, and VAC, which means vacuum. So essentially, at sea level is in lower atmosphere, and vacuum is in space. So there's a slight difference here. You get more thrust in vacuum or in space than you do in the lower atmosphere. And they'll change, those numbers will change depending on what engine you pick. The other thing here is engine ISP, or specific impulse, which is also split up to ASL and vacuum. And what this, you can read this as the amount of thrust you will get per unit of fuel. So a bit of a difference here. It's less efficient, fuel efficient in the atmosphere than it is in vacuum, but not a huge difference between the two. Now, and then the gimbal just means this nozzle at the bottom. Some engines are directional, as far as they can change the direction of this nozzle to basically help steer you. Others don't have any gimbaling, and they just point straight down and they just push you in one direction, and you have to use something else to help steer your direction. So now if I click on this one, you'll see that the other one was getting like 168, I think, thrust in atmosphere and 200 in vacuum. So this gets way less. So you're not going to get near as much thrust with this. If I look at the specific gravity, The other one, I forget the number, I think it was like 270 in atmosphere. This one only gets 85, so this is also a lot less fuel efficient in atmosphere. So it's kind of like, why would you use this engine at all with that number? Well, if you go over to vacuum, this is 345 ISP in vacuum. And the other engine, I believe, was like 320. So this becomes much more fuel efficient when you're in space. And once you're in space, you don't need as much thrust all at once because you can just burn your engines longer, as long as you're not in threat of, you're in a suborbital trajectory and you're about to crash or something like that. You can just burn as long as you want, and to get the same result, burn maybe twice as long or 3 times as long as you would with the bigger engine. But with this one, you're going to be a lot more fuel efficient. So yeah, it'll take you longer to get to the speed or set your trajectory the way you want it, but you'll do it using a lot less fuel. So this is a very good engine to pick for when you're in space. So we're going to choose this engine. And the moon, well, it still has gravity and you still have to fight it. This engine's plenty for that. Now you'll notice that as soon as I put that on there, we popped up some numbers here. And again, I'm not going to talk about these too much. They don't really matter. I mean, they're interesting and you might want to look at them, but this gives a thrust to weight ratio and our delta V. Now this is total delta V and delta V just for the stage. As we get more stages, the total will change, but the amount per stage won't, unless we're editing that particular stage. The thrust to weight is important because when you are not in an orbital trajectory, or you're not in orbit, if you're in suborbital, or especially if you're just starting to launch, you need this to be greater than 1. If you're less than 1, you're basically not pushing on the ship as hard as gravity is pulling you down, so you're not going to move. This has 2.34, which is plenty. Most of the time I kind of aim for about 1.5 to 2. And the difference here between the thrust to weight ratio and the max, and you can change this to show you different things, but the max is in vacuum. This is on the surface of Kerbin. So if I were to launch this, as I gained altitude, the thrust to weight ratio would keep increasing until I got into space, and then space would be a max of 3.79. And then the delta V, there's some things you can look up online to figure out how much delta V you need to do different things. So I have a general idea in my head of how much I need. That's not enough to even get into orbit. You need close to 4,000 to get in orbit. But this just tells me how much I'm going to have once I get down to just this stage. Now the other thing I'll point out here is our staging. You want to make sure your parachute is on the very last stage all by itself. And then this separates, and then the engine here. Now, this is our lander. The other thing the engine has, if I just right click here, is a crash tolerance of 7 meters per second. So I have to be going less than that as I descend when I impact the ground. Otherwise it'll damage, if not outright destroy, this engine. Now, the other thing about this engine is you can see, I mean, the nozzle is kind of small. It's a single point of contact. If I were to land on an uneven surface, or even if I were to land on an even surface, this thing would be kind of top heavy. It would be, balancing on this thing precariously, and it could probably tip over. So we don't want that. So what we want to do is land on some feet. So what I'm going to do is go in here to utility, and I'm going to grab these micro landing struts. And then if you try to connect it, it'll just connect one, and one's not going to do us any good. So if I hit X, you'll see that this changes to a 3. If on the base game, it'll show just a symbol that'll tell you got 3. Then it makes a tripod. You can see I got 3 of them here. So I'm going to place them somewhat evenly around the opening for the pod here. Now when you attach them, they're retracted. Now, of course, if I landed like this, I would still hit the engine. These aren't doing me any good. Well, these actually fold out when you hit the landing gear key, which is G. Problem is, I can't really tell how tall they are when they fold out. So how do I know I have them in a good position, or if this is the right ones to use? Well, if I right-click on the part, it says Start Retracted. Well, if I hit this button next to it, it'll go Start Deployed, and hey, look at that. They're folded out, and we can tell what's going to hit the ground first. Well, right now the engine's going to hit the ground first, and that's not what we want. So I'm going to click this, and I'm going to drag it down until we have the feet are going to hit first, plus a little bit of give, because these things have some shock, so they'll move a little bit. Not usually a whole lot, but so that'll be good there. Now I want to add a ladder so my Kerbin can get out and actually walk around on the moon once we land. He could just jump out and hit the ground. I mean, he'll be stunned for a second, but he'll be fine. And then he could probably jump in the low gravity or use his jetpack to get back in here. But a ladder would just make things easier. So I'm going to go to the second page here, and I'm going to grab this Telus Mobility Enhancer. Now, it's trying to add 3 of them. I don't want that, so I'm going to hit Shift-X to go back down to just 1. I'll attach it, and again, just like the landing gear, it was starting retracted, so I'm going to right-click and go Extend Ladder to see how tall it's going to be. Now, this goes almost as low as the legs. I probably don't need it quite that low. I'll move it up just a little bit because it doesn't need to go all the way to the ground. But if I put it there, we should be in good shape. There's a bit of a gap here between these rungs on the pod itself and here. I don't think my Kerbin's going to be able to bridge that without falling, so I'm going to grab this Pegasus 1 Mobility Enhancer, and I'll throw it right there. And that should be enough so we can crawl all the way down and all the way back up. The last thing we will need is this has, if I right click on the pod here, you see this has reaction wheels. What reaction wheels are is, it's based on real technology. It's using flywheels and other things. Basically, using electricity instead of a gimbaling rocket, you can change the direction the rocket is pointed. You can rotate it, you can change the pitch, yaw, and all that. But it burns electricity, and there's only 50 electrical charge on this particular setup. Now I could add batteries to add more, but really that maneuvering with the reaction wheels doesn't eat up that much electricity all at once. So I just need something to charge the batteries I already have. So I'm going to grab this photovoltaic panels, the 1x6. That means there'll be one string that comes out 6 panels long. There's also 3x2, but I like these ones. So I'm going to put this on here, and I'm going to hit X again so I get 2 of them. So there's one on the opposite side, and just click. So you see I have the 2 there. So when I get up to space, I can fold these out and I can recharge my batteries. That'll be fine. Now, once you're in space though, and you want to, the landing gear, you can hit G to deploy and retract it. But the ladder, there's not a key to do that, nor is there with the photo panels. So you have to actually right click and tell them to deploy, and only do one at a time. So if I right click this one, hit deploy, this one will pop out and I don't have to rotate, right click deploy, and not impossible, but it's kind of annoying. So if I go over here to action groups, here's the ones that are already set up for staging, for landing gear, lights, and a bunch of other things. If I go to custom one, and then I'll click on my solar panels, and you'll see just for a second they'll turn kind of a dark blue, and they're staying dark blue this time. Sometimes they don't always do that, but then I go to toggle panels, and I add it to group actions. So what that's going to do is when I hit the number 1 button or key on my keyboard, these will deploy, and then when I hit the 1 button again, they'll retract. So that will be helpful. And then if I go to 2 and then click on my ladder, I go to toggle ladder, now when I hit the number 2 key, my ladder will retract, or deploy and retract. So that's pretty handy. So I'll go back to parts mode. I'm going to right click on the ladder to make it retract, and right click on the landing gear to make it retract. So alright, we have our moon lander and launcher to go back home. So we're in pretty good shape. Now, what's the job we have before landing on the moon? Well, we got to get to the moon. So we've gone up to space. Hopefully we've gotten into a complete orbit. This next stage may have to help us with orbit a little bit, but we need to actually get from Kerbin to the moon and get into a good moon orbit, and then we got to slow down so we're actually in a landing trajectory before we want to kick this thing off, because we don't have a whole lot of fuel here, so we don't want to have this thing do too much or we'll run out of fuel and not be able to get back home. So what I'm going to do is once again go back to structural, grab our stack decoupler, attach that there. One thing you'll notice is it puts the engine and the decoupler on different stages. That's not really necessary. Pardon me. You can have them on the same stage, so as soon as this decouples, your engine will be active. Just saves you some button presses is all. So we'll do that. We're going to use our, sorry, we don't want engines, we want fuel tanks. We're going to use our tall fuel tank. And then again, I'm going to throw on the Terrier engine. Now here you'll see our thrust to weight ratio is less than 1, and significantly less than 1. So if I were to try to launch this right now off the ground, it wouldn't move. But our max is 1.62, which means once we're in space, which is where we should be by the time we're using it, we'll have plenty of thrust to weight. The other thing is, even if it stayed at 0.79 in space, it doesn't really matter, because as long as we're not about to crash into something, if we're just doing some maneuvers, it's still going to push us along. It's just going to do it very slowly. So we just have to burn longer. And because of where this is at and the configuration, we don't really care. You don't want to run that situation when you're still trying to get into orbit necessarily, or especially if you're in the environment, because it's just not going to push you hard enough, and you have to go at weird angles, and you end up being really inefficient and burning through a lot of your fuel. And then you can see again here, so this new stage, I have about 2400 delta V total for the ship and for the stage, but when I go up here, the top stage, which is my lander, only has 1500 delta V, but the total for the entire ship is almost 4000. So this, except for the fact our thrust to weight ratio is way too low, this amount of delta V could get us in orbit of Kerbin all on its own, but it's not going to get us where we want to go, which is to the moon. So now, what do we do before we actually have to travel to the moon and get in orbit there? Well, we got to get in orbit around Kerbin, and it takes a lot of energy to do that. So what we're going to do is go back to structural. We're going to add a decoupler. We're going to add our fuel tank. And then if we go to our engines, we don't want to use this Terrier again, because we already know, and especially because we're going to have more weight now, we're going to have near the thrust to weight. But we do want one with a gimbal to help steer us. So if I go to the swivel engine, it's got a heck of a lot more thrust. It's got more fuel efficiency in atmosphere, and we're going to burn this right off the bat. It's not going to do as well in space, but we're probably going to have it ejected before we get there anyway, so we don't care. So this will be a good one to get us going. If I attach that, we can now see for this stage we have a 1.48, which is, we wouldn't want to go much lower than that. Usually I try to be at a minimum of 1.5. Our max 2.08. We'll again switch our stages so the oh, that's not how I want to do it. Or is it? Wait a minute. I want to put that there. Yeah. So anyway, this takes us up to 5000 delta V. So we'll get into orbit comfortably with this. We should be able to get started on the way to the moon with this, but we won't be able to land. So we need to build more. But rather than go vertical, we're now going to go lateral, I guess. So if I go to structural and I grab this radial decoupler, I have it set to pairs right now, but I want 6. So I'm going to set six of these guys, and then of course I'll add some fuel tanks to them, and I'll again grab the tall ones. Sometimes lining these upright can be a little tricky, but yep, that looks good. So what that'll do is these fuel tanks, when they empty, I can hit my stage and they'll all pull off and remove the weight that they would have added. Now, I already have a steering engine, so for these engines, I don't need to steer anymore. For bigger craft, you may want more than one steering engine, but for these, I can just use the even more powerful Reliance. They're slightly bigger, as you can see, so they'll give me more power. They'll only push straight up, but this middle one will steer me. Now, that has me up to just about 7,000 delta V, which is not bad. I'm also going to add, just because it looks nice and gives a little bit of aerodynamics, I'll add the caps there, or the nose cones. So this isn't bad. This might get us there, but we got a couple problems right off the bat. One is, because the way we did how we added things, my middle engine doesn't fire until after these have burned off. Well, again, these don't provide steering. So I'm going to go straight up, or however, I might tilt a little bit because of gravity or wind resistance. What was it called again? My reaction wheels will help me steer a little bit, but they're not powerful enough, more than likely, to counteract all this weight that I have. So I want to make sure this burns right from the beginning. And when I move that down, suddenly my delta V drops considerably. It went from 7,000 to 6,600. Well, it's because rather than burn all this fuel, get to a certain altitude, then burn this one, I'm now burning all of these. So it's not quite as efficient. But what I can do is I can use asparagus staging, which is essentially just changing my staging a little bit and adding some fuel lines, and without adding any additional fuel tanks or engines, I can get that back up to 7,000 and actually past 7,000 up to about, I think 7,400 is where it'll probably go. So how do you do that? Well, if I go back to fuel tanks, there's this external fuel duct, and this is basically a fuel line. And right now it's trying to do symmetrical. I don't want to do that. I'm going to hit Shift X until I get down to just one. And is this the one I want to start with? Yeah, it'll be fine. Doesn't really matter. So it's source to target. So I click on this, and then it gives me an extension. I can click to other things. I'll connect it there. And what that's going to do is it's going to pull fuel from this tank to this tank. And essentially what that means is when these two engines kick off, both of them are going to be taking fuel from this tank. This tank's going to stay full. Now, technically you could say, okay, this tank's burning, or this engine's burning fuel from this tank, but it's being replaced by fuel from this tank. But so this is the only one that's going to drain. So what will happen is once this tank's empty, this engine will shut off because it's not getting fuel back from this one. But this engine will keep burning, and I'll have a full tank to burn from. So if I do that again here, now all three of these engines are running off of this tank. So this tank's going to burn through 3 times faster than it would have otherwise. But once this empties, this engine will shut off, and these two will continue to burn off this tank, which will go twice as fast as it would have otherwise. Actually, that's not true because it's feeding off of this one, but I don't feel like doing all the math to really explain it fully. And then once that one shuts off, this one will still have a fuel tank, which will then at that point burn as it normally would before it empties. Now with this third one, I have 6 total engines, so I want to do this in 2 sets of 3s to keep things symmetrical. Because if you don't burn fuel evenly, it'll actually cause your weight to be off center and cause you problems. So this one, and it can be a little bit tricky to try to do this, but I'll click from there to the center. So now same concept, but the center is our last engine. And then for these other ones, I'm going to do the same thing, and again in a symmetrical pattern. And then see if that'll attach. Alright, there it goes. Now my delta V didn't really change at all. Well, I guess it did. Actually, it went to 7,000. So it went kind of back to where we were before I moved that one engine down. Now we can still increase this a little bit, because part of the problem is, yeah, that's great that I'm, making some fuel efficiencies here, but I'm still dragging the weight of every single one of these until they're all empty, and then I eject them all at once. So what we want to do is set it up so the tanks eject as soon as they're empty. So I'm going to go back over here to my staging. I'm going to hit plus twice to add 2 sections. I'm going to click on my decouplers here, which will open them up. They're all highlighted, which means they're all selected. But as you hover over each of them, you'll see in the center, it highlights the one you're at. And these are my first 2 that are going to empty on the outside, so I want to make sure they're the ones that disconnect first. So I'll find that, I'll do a double click to highlight just that one, and I'm going to drag it to the bottom empty one. And then I'll do it again for the one on the other side. So now, when these 2 empty, I'll hit staging. The rest will stay attached, but just these 2 will detach. And then I'll do, these are the next 2 that will empty. Okay, so now, again, this one and the one across of it will burn through first. As soon as they're empty, I'll hit staging, and that one and the one across from it will drop off, and the rest of these engines will all be full of fuel and continue to burn. And then the same thing will happen with these ones and then these ones. And at that point, I'll be at a pretty good altitude, and I'll have this entire middle rocket full of fuel, and we'll be in good shape. And if you look at our delta V, again, I was right with my number, only because I've built this rocket a couple times already. I'm at 7447 meters per second. Before I added these fuel lines and changed those stages, I was down to like 6,600. So almost 800 meters per second in Delta V was added simply by changing how the fuel and staging went. So that's pretty good. The last thing I will cover just real quick is actually, I'm not going to cover it real quick. I'm going to end this video and I'll cover it in part 2 right before we do the launch. See you there.